Hi, everyone. First, I wanted to let you know about a change we're making to the podcast. For years, we have been calling it Jungian Anthology since we started it in 2014 or so. And that made sense when really there was only one thing that we did. We recently changed it from Jungian Anthology Podcast to Jungian Anthology Radio. But to make things a little more clear, and since we now have multiple shows that all have their own names, we think it makes more sense to have something that is a little more just associated with the Jung Institute of Chicago, so it's clear that this is our project. So from now on, this podcast feed is going to be called Jung Chicago Radio, and everything is going to change accordingly. If you ever need to subscribe to the podcast or find it, you can search for Jung Chicago Radio, and that's how you'll find it. Also, we have a bunch of upcoming programs, so I'll just say please check out our website, jungchicago.org. Thanks. For this episode of our Institute Archives, we have Dreams, Gifts from the Unconscious with June Singer. June Singer was a major figure in the development of the Jungian movement in the United States. She earned her Ph.D. in psychology from Northwestern University and completed training as a Jungian analyst in Zurich, Switzerland. During the 1960s, Dr. Singer founded the Analytical Psychology Club of Chicago, which eventually became the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. Her text, Boundaries of the Soul, is considered to be one of the best introductions to Jungian thought. In this lecture, June Singer draws from personal and professional experience to discuss the importance of dreams, those gifts from the unconscious which profoundly imbue our conscious lives. This program provides an excellent introduction not only to Jung's dream theory, but also its application in psychoanalysis from one of the masters of the art. It was recorded in 1975. The audio quality is not the best, but this is the best quality we can really get from this old recording, and we think it's worth sharing anyway. Thanks.
Joan and Stan Groff make a very hard act to follow, particularly because I'm an analyst. And after what they said about analysis, it almost puts me in a defensive position, but not quite, because I'm not a psychoanalyst, I'm not of the traditional analytic school, but I belong to the school of Jungians, and so I'm a follower of that rebellious psychologist who broke away from Freud because he felt that the personal view of the unconscious was far too limited, and who himself had experiences of a transpersonal nature which in many ways resembled some of the things that the Groffs were talking about, and who also came in touch with those kinds of experiences with his patients. And so he approached the unconscious in quite a different way. Now, Jung was interested in the study of dreams because, for one reason, they supply an ongoing, day-by-day contact, or I should say night-by-night contact with the unconscious, so that we can live in a relationship with the unconscious without having to depend on these tremendous experiences, which I grant are extremely important and opening up experiences. But there's also the importance of the day-by-day contact and the being a friend of the unconscious and knowing the unconscious as a part of oneself that one can be in constant touch with and not something that has to be feared or anticipated or prepared for, but a part of everyday living. Now, every day in my work, I'm confronted with the question of what is real. Every day I work on the dreams that people bring me, and I hear them say, this and this happened in a dream. And then they go on to relate it to what happened in what they call real life. So often as I sit there listening, I wonder, why do we feel that dreams are not real life, or that real life is something quite different from a dream? The Taoist sage Chuang Tzu, who transcended the illusory dust of the world, tells a story in his inner chapters about the equality of all things. In this writing, he responds to a question asked by the Lady Li, who is the daughter of a border guard and who was taken captive by the Duke of Qin. At first, She wept until her dress was soaked with tears. But after a while, she got used to the palace and to enjoying sharing the Duke's bed and the delicious food that was provided. And she became very happy. And she wondered why she had cried so bitterly. And she asked the question, how can I tell whether the dead are not amazed that they ever clung to life? Chuang Tzu responds to this question, and he says, those who dream of a great feast may weep the next morning. Those who dream of weeping may enjoy the hunt the next day. While they dream, they do not know they are dreaming. Only after they awake do they know it was a dream. Some may even interpret their dreams while dreaming. By and by, there will be a great awakening, and then we will know that this is all a great dream. All the while, the fools think they are awake, appearing to understand things, calling this man ruler and that man herdsman. How stupid. When you say you are dreaming, I'm dreaming too. Now, these words may sound like double talk, yet after 10,000 generations, we will meet a great sage who can explain all this, or it may happen any day now. That's the end of the quote from Chuang Tzu. Now, my dear friends, in case you're expecting that I am that sage who is going to explain to you the nature of dreams, I'm going to have to tell you that I can't do that. When I was a child, I paid attention to my dreams, although I didn't understand them then and often carried them around with me through the days. When later I studied psychology, I learned that dreams were associated with rapid eye movements and that dream states could be monitored on an electroencephalograph so that one could tell from the frequency of the brain waves whether one was dreaming or not. Then I went through my analysis, and I learned that dreams were a product of the unconscious and that we could discover a lot about ourselves by working with our dreams. And then I was training to become a Jungian analyst, and I learned a theoretical approach to the interpretation of dreams, how to use this to uncover the deeper layers of the psyche, and especially of the psyche of disturbed and depressed or distressed or neurotic or psychotic individuals. Now that all this is behind me, I still pay attention to my dreams and to those of other people, and I often carry them around with me through the day, but it's stored in this magnificent supercomputer we call the human brain. The human computer, being alive, has the capacity to regenerate itself and to energize itself and to motivate itself and execute its own orders. So this living computer that has been programmed by its genetic components in the first place now processes the information it receives. It's able to scan a vast array of information from the physical world and the human world and from history and the contemporary arts and sciences. If mere machines can accomplish what they do in the solution of technical problems, why should we be surprised if the living computer that is the brain can make statements about what is happening in distant places, can inform individuals about their own problems and needs, and even predict the future? Why should we be surprised if the biopsychological organ that invented the computer should also have the power to reach deep into the human psyche and guide explorers into many fields of consciousness? I don't say that we are explorers of the unconscious, for I feel that the distinctions we make between consciousness and the unconscious in traditional psychology are too gross to be very useful. And I want to add parenthetically that since I've been in California for the last couple of weeks, this intuition of mine has been corroborated 1,000-fold. I live in Chicago, where we're way behind you folks out here in studies of consciousness, although we are getting the light out there in the Midwest bit by bit. But I attended the meeting of the Association for Transpersonal Psychology and had my eyes opened in a lot of different ways, both Western methods of achieving other levels of consciousness, like biofeedback training, for example, and the Oriental counterparts of yoga and the comparisons between the two. And I also had the opportunity to attend a workshop on Tai Chi and calligraphy, and I saw consciousness expressed through the body in a way that I hadn't been in touch with before. And it certainly, I agree with the Groffs, leaves traditional psychology far behind. And I think of Freud's terms, the preconscious, which is so close to consciousness that it's really on the borderline, and the unconscious, which he understood as a pool of, to a very large extent at least, as a pool of repressions, a kind of garbage heap of consciousness that we have to somehow clean out. And I can well understand why it was that Jung, after having studied with Freud and learned a great deal, finally had to turn around and go his own way because of the kinds of experiences that he had that were not explained by a personal psychology that dealt with personal autobiography. So Jung used the term personal unconscious to talk about all of that individual unconscious material which we all have, and which is, goodness knows, it's enough of a problem to us that we do have to deal with it. I don't think we can go from all our complexes and inhibitions and problems straight into a psychedelic experience and transcend the problems of everyday living. I think these are, in a sense, two different things, but also very closely related. And it's through dream life that the relationship becomes very clear, because here it is the personal experience seen very often in a transcendent dimension. Now, Jung understood this when he developed his concept of the collective unconscious with its mythic images, which show very clearly the vast capacity and range of the human psyche. This concept of the collective unconscious takes depth psychology into areas where Freud, like so many other angels, feared to tread. But Jung rushed in and came face to face with the non-rational. He studied it not only in dreams, but in various esoteric traditions. He was interested particularly in alchemy, which I personally believe had something to do with substances that produced experiences very much like those that we hear about in LSD research. The life and death and rebirth experiences are experienced through matter by those alchemists who were concerned with the personal experience that was only manifested through the matter with which they were dealing, that was going along as a parallel to it. And Jung was also concerned with the macrocosmic, microcosmic aspects of man and the universe to the degree that he wanted to explore astrology and see what its fascination was for so many people. And he was one of the first to bring yoga and Zen and the I Ching and the Tibetan Book of the Dead to the West in the 1930s, when they hadn't yet reached the shelves of the college students. All of these areas then were on the borderlines of Western thought. And their very transpersonal qualities prove the existence of an unconscious that's founded on the collective experience of the human race. Dreams and visions of one culture, as the Groffs told you, often present themselves in images of another culture, possibly in beliefs of an entirely different age. Jung listened to these dreams and also to the language of the schizophrenic. And he really heard that language with all its fantastic jumble of myth and mysticism and religion and occultism. He realized that there, too, was evidence of a collective pattern shared by madmen and by shamans, and sometimes even by geniuses. And he took all this material very seriously as he studied the collective unconscious. Now, just as Jung went beyond Freud in this respect, so I believe it's necessary for our generation to go beyond Jung in recognizing, for example, that we can no longer talk about consciousness and the unconscious as we once did in terms of ego consciousness and preconscious and personal unconscious and even collective unconscious. Seems to me that we need to recognize that there is no real barrier between consciousness and the unconscious. There are simply states of consciousness spreading out like so many concentric circles from a center that we call ego consciousness or focused awareness. And encompassing as it spreads out like a ripple in a pond when you drop a pebble into it, It reaches as far as the eye can see and the mind can conceive. And there, beyond that, where there's no longer any light, there lies what we call the unconscious. So what is the unconscious? I believe it's experienced differently by different people because our boundaries are all different depending on our own experiences and the limits of our awareness. And from wherever our awareness ends, the unconscious stretches out into infinity. Of course, I don't know what infinity is, except by using a definition of exclusion, which is to say that infinity is what finitude is not. On the other hand, infinity also includes what finitude is. So without getting into that weighty question, I hope we can agree that for our purposes, the unconscious is out there beyond the boundaries of our individual states of consciousness, however far they may reach. And because everybody's consciousness reaches limits sooner or later, there is a collective unconscious, or if you prefer, a great cosmic mystery in which all mankind is involved. And so it is with dreaming. Dreams that we recall, and these are the only ones we can speak of, are states of consciousness. Some are closer to the center of conscious awareness and usually relate to the dreamer's life or to his immediate experiences of the preceding day or the more distant past. And others stretch very far afield and go into the cosmic experiences which are in many ways similar to the ones that the Groffs were talking about. The dreams, these kinds of dreams, deal with archetypal images. And archetypal images are no more than the content within these very matrices that the Groffs were talking about. These forms which don't have any content of themselves, but which the culture or the experience of the person pours into these generalized matrices. Even these dreams, however far out as to state of consciousness, bear some significance in terms of the life of the dreamer, although the connection may not be immediately apparent. And I want to stress this because I think it's so important that we live in the transpersonal world, but that we also live in the personal world, that we don't somehow take off from reality and get lost in a world where we're not responsible to our fellow human beings and to ourselves and to our own development and growth. I think the young woman who mentioned that she was in analysis and it took so long and it was so hard hit on something very important. Because even though the psychedelic experience may open the door and get something started, as a dream sometimes can do, and perhaps more profoundly through that other experience, the integrating of it, the making it your own, and the applying it in terms of your own life is extremely important. Now, what I like to do in the time allotted, I have a couple of dreams that I want to talk with you about. They're dreams of a young woman whom I have in analysis, and she's given me permission to use her two dreams. And we may not get to the second one until after lunch, so that I would like to just take my time and go into this dream, and then if we have a few minutes to pause for some questions, and then pick it up again after lunch. Now, this is an archetypal dream which has collective material in it. And I think it'll show you how a dream can provide the dreamer with several levels of understanding, both the personal and the transpersonal. And I want to do this because I believe that many of you have dreams and you're concerned with dreams which you can partially relate to the incidents of your life and partially not. Now, this particular dream I told to a group of psychiatrists, and one of them had trained in Freudian analysis, and he immediately came up with an interpretation that was right down the line, Freudian interpretation. And I think maybe when you hear this dream, you might relate to that in your own minds. I'm sure you're so familiar with it, I don't need to go into that aspect of it. But then you'll want to compare it with another way of looking at it that takes into account the transpersonal. Now, this woman is in her mid-30s, and she's in the process of getting a divorce from a man, we call him Harry, and this is the dream, just as she reported it to me. I'm in a big house with bare rooms with high ceilings, high ceilings. Think of this room. Ceiling is important in this dream. Harry is there with me. The dream is long, and the end is very elusive and definitive. Harry goes out, leaving me alone in this room. I look up abstractedly at the chandelier and sense a kind of fearful or anxious challenge rising in me. Sometimes I think I should not pursue this feeling, but force it down and try to forget it. Instead, it bursts forth and comes out. I challenge God or some power to give me a sign. With this, I am suddenly lifted violently upward toward the ceiling and the chandelier. I panic, and my responses are delayed by the dread I fear. I'm frozen up in midair up near the ceiling. Then I quickly start to recite the Lord's Prayer, although I realize I can barely remember it. So long has it been since I've prayed it. Somehow, though, I get through, and I can feel the force that has raised me diminishing a little. Then I remember my favorite childhood ejaculation, Jesus, Mary, Joseph. I say this a few times, then I'm lowered to the floor. I feel a little like Dorothy returning from the land of Oz, not being certain whether I imagined it all or whether I was truly raised up. But I am relieved that I managed to get down off the ceiling through my own means. That is, via the magic words, as it were. Harry comes back in then, and I tell him excitedly what has just happened. When he seems skeptical, I offer to demonstrate. So I concentrate on the challenge, hoping to be blasted up to the ceiling again. Instead, I just push myself up a few inches off the floor by the force of my own will and my desire to levitate. I'm a little surprised at this, but then I remembered it's the sort of thing I could do regularly as a child, although it seems to take more pushing, more force now. Then I say to Harry, this isn't what I meant. I'm only holding myself up by my own power now. On waking, I'm fearful that the dream might have been a sign that the devil is near, that I have too long neglected religion, that the devil is real. The end of the dream. Now, this dream I found remarkable in the way that it pulsates in and out through many levels and kinds of reality. I'm not going to try to interpret it for you, although I'm aware that a perfectly beautiful Freudian interpretation could be made, and even more beautiful Jungian performance in interpretation, because all the elements are there that tempt an analyst to virtuosity. But I'd rather simply explore the dream. I've come to feel more and more that if we look at what is there in a dream, we will see far more than if we come to the dream with all our fancy theories and attempt to fit our inspired imagery into it. In dealing with a dream such as this, and you might want to do this with your own dreams, you might begin with paying attention to how you felt when you woke up. The dreamer here woke up with powerful emotions of fear and the guilty feeling that she had done something terribly wrong. So we begin with this feeling that came out at the end of the dream and thread our way through the dream with this in mind. Now let's look at some of the levels of consciousness. The house in which the action takes place reminds the dreamer of the house in which she grew up, only now it's quite bare. So she's on the level of childhood again, in one sense. Only the details are lost to awareness. The furniture is gone. No one from her childhood is present. It's the barest remembrance. And her isolation and loneliness of those days is suggested by the dream. She feels the same way. I ask her about the feelings, and this is what comes up. Harry is present, but then he leaves. This refers to her marriage that's now ending and to her present aloneness. But it also means, on a deeper level, that whatever Harry has represented for her, the security, the practical orientation which she, being highly imaginative, had not developed in herself, this was absent and wanting. Now she feels this challenge rising within herself, the need to demand of God that he show himself. She feels anxious. She knows she's taking a great risk, but she cannot resist finding out if there is a source of security, if there is someone she can depend on. This is a great archetypal theme which occurs over and over again in mythology, the desire of a human being to command a god. We talk about this together, And as we talk about the dream, the old stories come to mind. We remember the mortal woman, Semele, who was pregnant with Dionysus by Zeus. And she demanded that the King of Heaven, the Lord of the Thunderbolt, show himself to her in his full splendor. At first, Zeus didn't want to do this because he knew that there would be terrible consequences, and he warned her. But she insisted, and he had sworn by the river Styx that he would grant her whatever she asked. So he does show himself to her as she requested. But before that awful glory of burning light, she dies. And then there is the golden youth, Phaeton, whose father was the sun god and whose mother was a mortal woman. And he, too, required of the sun that he prove his fatherhood by allowing the boy to ride across the skies in the sun chariot. And we know that the boy could not contain the power that surged in those reins, jerking them this way and that. And the horses ran amok, and the boy was thrown off the chariot and headlong into the sea. We talked about this imagery, and we talked about one more. What happened when God told Moses to bring the people to the land of Israel? And Moses pleads aloud to God, "Show me thy glory." And the Lord replies, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, but you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." And we remember the words, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." And we know that this fear is what our dreamer was experiencing. She'd been reared in the traditional Catholic Church, but during her college years, she'd come to question what she'd learned and much of what she'd accepted on faith. She'd become particularly interested in some Eastern religions, in which a philosophical approach could paradoxically, to be sure, exist side by side with a demonology that was polytheistic in nature. Intellectually, she had convinced herself that she had shifted her belief structure into something quite different. From the point of view of the archaic psyche, God and all of his manifestations, and Satan and his numberless hordes were still present, only their names had been changed. Jesus, Mary, Joseph had been exchanged perhaps for Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. But when a lady is dangling from the ceiling, who's she going to appeal to for help? The dreams demonstrate that no matter how sophisticated we become as we grow older, we still revert to the forms of behavior and the settings of the soul which were established in our first years. Our dreams show us the truth of this, what we are reacting to. The dreamer at this time of her life was taking her first step away from security. She had just left her husband. This was a recapitulation of how she left her parents when she had married. Now facing a new challenge, her father was not there for security, nor her husband, and the ultimate source of strength to which she could appeal was God. However, she felt she had not the right to appeal to him since she had denied her early faith, but she wanted his support. But she was not sure whether he did, in fact, exist. She wanted proof she would challenge him. And yet she knew in this deeper state of consciousness that there would be the devil to pay if her prayers were answered. She does invoke the devil in a sense when she uses her magical mantra to coerce God into letting her get down from the ceiling. But now comes a very interesting part, when she feels like Dorothy returning from the land of Oz, rubbing her eyes awake to find the adventure was nothing but a dream. Or had she imagined the whole thing through her own efforts? Here are two other stages of consciousness, one in which she feels she was dreaming, the other in which she believes the event to have happened while she was awake. But from our vantage point, we know that both of these perceptions were still part of another state, where she is dreaming the whole thing. She dreams she had been dreaming, and she dreams that she was awake. What is real? I pose the question, but I'm not sure about the answer. The dream continued as Harry returned, and the dreamer tells him about this exciting event. She has played God, as it were, by performing this miracle. Now Harry plays the role of the doubter, but the dreamer is so inflated by her own belief, since she assimilated to herself the power of God, she is convinced that she can pull it off again. but this time she can only levitate a few inches. I find this astonishing. If she could not have risen at all, it would have been clear enough this is reality, and what happened before must have been a dream. But here is a residue of the mysterious, except that this time she's not in control. Very clearly there's a message being received that somebody else is running the show. She remembers that this is how it was when she was a child. She could only levitate a few inches, and it's harder to do now than it was then. Or did she really levitate as a child? Is the dreaming consciousness returning her to an earlier reality or to an earlier fantasy? Within the context of the dream, what does it mean that she says to Harry as she struggles to maintain herself a few inches off the floor, "This isn't what I meant. I'm only holding myself up by my own power now"? Although it seems to her within the dream that what is happening now is real, she awakens with a fear that you and I, in our rational moment, would probably consider to be on the fantastic side. That is, that the devil is near and is very real. At the center of this dream, there is ego consciousness. The dreamer is herself, an individual, intact, self-aware. But she is also the embodiment of the human spirit as it seeks to comprehend the world beyond consciousness, the world beyond the ego consciousness, that is, the world within the worlds and the worlds beyond the worlds. Embroiled as she is in the saga of her personal secular life, she's nevertheless cradled in the universe of the sacred. Focused as she is on her conscious everyday problems, there are ever present in the soft shadows that fall at evening and beyond those shadows in the darkness, the great existential concerns that are shared by all people to some extent. Dreams provide us with one way into these other states of consciousness. They provide us with that small light which enables us to find our way for some short distance into the fathomless night of the infinite. I'm going to save the second dream till after lunch. We have time maybe for one or two questions if you'd like to say something before we break. Yes, please.
This isn't relevant to that dream, but you notice that with Jung opens in mutual dreams and that kind of paranormal things.
Mutual dreams?
Where they two people have the same dream on the same
Yeah. Jung was very open to paranormal phenomena. In fact, he made a study, which incidentally is not very much publicized, on paranormal phenomena. He had published in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, the Zurich newspaper, a request that people should send in all kinds of paranormal experiences. And he was very much interested in studying them and trying to find out what that was all about, whether it was a projection of unconscious material that somehow was transmitted in this peculiar way through time and space, or whether it was something that was a phenomenon outside of the psychic realm. He did a great deal of exploration about that, yes.
If it's a fragmentary conclusion that was just as affected the outside
He, I don't think, came to any conclusion about it. I think that he, the question is, did Jung come to any conclusions about such paranormal experiences as out-of-body experiences, for example? I don't think he came to any conclusion about it, except that he reported what he experienced and what his patients experienced. And in his psychological autobiography, his autobiography of his own inner state, he talked about an out-of-body experience which he had when he was very ill and when his own consciousness level was altered in much the same way as it might be altered in a drug state. And at that time, he floated about on the ceiling of his room, and he could look down on himself in his bed, and he also floated out for a time and could look down on the earth from a higher place, and then he returned into his body. He only said it happened. He didn't explain it. Yes?
When you use the term collective autonomy, Are you thinking something that comes to us through our genes, or something that is telepathically radiated around us, or how do you use that term?
Jung felt that we were born with it, that's not to exclude the possibility of our picking up material from wherever it is, but that we're born with the capacity to actualize this knowledge of all the ages which is encoded into us, into the, he didn't know about the whole DNA molecule and the way that's coded, but he had intuited something very similar in his concept of the collective unconscious. He did not feel, he would agree with the Groffs, that man comes into the world a tabula rasa waiting to be imprinted, but that he already has the capacity and the seeds of all knowledge that he will ever actualize. I think it's 12:30 now. I think we should break for lunch, and then we'll talk for a while after lunch. We'll continue. It seems as though I did quite a lot of talking, so I'm ready to do a little listening now. If somebody has something they want to say or share or ask. This young lady here.
My name is Mr. Common. What did you attribute initially about the alien to her feeling of the presence in the reality of the
The question is, to what did I attribute the presence or the reality of the devil at the end of the dream when she awakened? Remember, at the beginning of the dream, she had a feeling that something was prodding her to do something that she shouldn't do. And then once she had followed this voice, which I think she felt was not a good voice, but a devilish voice, she'd had this experience. Then she tried to do it on her own again. In other words, she was once more tempting fate, which was again prodded by the devil. It was something like Eve's taking the apple, I think. It was a real challenge. And she felt very guilty about it. She felt that that was inspired by the devil. Yes, sir.
Well, the danger in that is that if you are dealing with a person from different culture,
yes,
that person may have very different associations. Now, is it that the problem is that with your own notion, the therapist, your own notions about what the reality is and what the mythology is, it's trying to interpret some person unique.
Right. That's very important that you asked that. The question was, isn't there a danger when you're working with someone from another culture that you impose your own interpretation or your own mythology on the individual? And of course, that is a very great danger. But being aware of it, and I'm aware of that danger, I work with the person to get that individual's associations. And generally, they come primarily from the patient. And in this case, she was familiar with this material, and she suggested it herself. So it was not an imposition on my part. But I think it's terribly important to evoke from the individual speaking about the dream and what's associated and what she would amplify, what she would pick out of her own experience or her knowledge about the material that might relate to it. If I were working with a person from another culture where I wasn't familiar, I would have to get from that person his or her own associations and build on that. It's very interesting to work in this way. You find out an awful lot because most people do have a rather different background than your own. Yeah.
Jung's idea of synchronicity. It's like, I had dreams that I thought were prophetic. They really were something that happened a long time ago. It just confused as far as time. It's like, I just know.
Well, this idea of synchronicity is a kind of understanding of events that happen at the same time but are not related by cause, but seem to have some kind of underlying phenomenon in common with each other. One can trace it back to these matrices, these archetypes, which may affect the dreamer in one way and the event in the other way. And then the dreamer has a dream and the event is experienced, and we relate the dream to the event, but it's not a causal relationship. Jung's definition of synchronicity was a meaningful coincidence. Please.
Yeah, so general question, but it seems you talked about dreams as if they sort of happen to us. The morning when you can see the dreams as an active sort of thing where you can in a sense control your dreams. I know that you certainly see some correlations in terms of when the exorcist would, people whether the night after the exorcist would go and be screaming in the middle of the night, come out of bed, become that kind of dream. You see dreams from back and forth, and that's a good experience to put yourself on, and you simply arrange yourself. The dreams of a spanning dream.
Well, the question is, do I see dreams as controllable by something that you do, that you sort of program yourself? I don't think so, but I'm not sure. I do think that dreams pick up things that happen to us in the day, as in after The Exorcist, so many people were dreaming of these sort of things, as the man suggested. But I know that I have many experiences in the course of a day, many contacts, many thoughts. Why does the unconscious, or that mechanism, the dreaming mechanism, pick one particular thing and not something else? It seems to me that the dreaming process has a kind of logic all its own, and maybe it has to do with synchronicity, that there is something constellated in everyday life that hooks into something that's going on in my psyche, and this then produces this curious amalgam. I have very often tried to dream about something, planned to dream about something. It doesn't usually work out as I plan. I'll frequently dream when I decide to dream about something, but what's so marvelous about dreams is that they are incomprehensible. They really challenge you to find out what kind of experience they're bringing to you to compensate the experience that you're having in your conscious life. Please. Just a moment. This gentleman first, and then you.
This would be in a dream when you decide you're going to test to see if the will's ready or not, and you put your hands on a piece of wood, you feel cold, you smell flower, you smell it.
Well, first of all, I need to say that I don't have any categorical explanations for any phenomena in dreams, because they always have to be understood in terms of the individual. But in a general way, when we're dreaming, we're not really unconscious, but we're in another level of consciousness. And as we saw in this dream, there were a lot of different things going on, and they were conflicting with each other. So here you are dreaming these marvelous things, and you're somewhere, there is that rational part still in process, which says, well, I don't believe it, I've got to touch it. And so you've got these various levels shifting, and that's the kind of dream you get sometimes.
That feeling process, and their soul of dreams about having a dream, and then at the start of the next night that they go to slow that dream with some sort of way to it out. And I was wondering how much you were ego involved in this.
The question has to do with the Sonoy culture and the way they work with dreams there, discussing them in groups and trying to determine whether they want to go on with the dream and somehow set themselves to continue that process. What do I think about that? Obviously, it works very well for the Sonoy culture. And it might work for us if we had a purpose in doing that. We do sometimes carry on a dream through our own fantasy and work it through in that way, through a process of active imagination where we allow the ego to interact with the unconscious while we are in a waking state. One thing I think is really a great value in a dream is that we don't program it, that we don't try to apply ego consciousness to it, because then we get the compensatory function working. If I'm in consciousness, for example, if I have an opinion of a certain person, I remember very well, I was working with an analyst, and I'll give you an example, and I had a little trouble working with him, but I wasn't too aware of it, and I thought things were going pretty well. And then one night I had a dream that we were sitting around in a room with quite a few people, and there was a heated discussion about analysis, and he got up and cussed me out and walked out and slammed the door and went down the stairs, and I was absolutely crushed. Well, I thought things were going pretty well, but you can believe I started to think about that analysis. And it so happened when I started to think about that and think what was going wrong with it, I realized that this man reminded me of another man with whom I had had a very bad experience, and that I was somehow getting this mixed in, and that although I was being, I thought, very objective with him, there was something that he was picking up coming from me that was negative. Well, the dream really brought that to consciousness, and the next time around, I told him about this. And we cleared the air, and we talked it over, and he felt better because he had, in fact, picked up something, and I realized that he was quite different from what I had imagined in a kind of unconscious way. Yes, did you? Yes.
Sorry, at one point, all this rabbi movement and one of my Jungian analysts use that now. Your patients, and you get the great many more dreams or calls.
Well, why don't we use the rapid eye movements and wake people up in the middle of the night to work on their dreams? Actually, the usefulness of that is primarily, I think, in experimentation. I don't know, but again, one might say the same thing one could say to using drugs as a regular business, using psychedelic drugs. It stimulates material which is of an unusual nature. And most of the people who come into analysis are, well, I shouldn't say most, but many of them, at least many of the people I see, have a life problem or a crisis that they need to deal with before they can transcend it. And if we push the unconscious too much, we get beyond material without going through material. And I think that would fall into that category. Mostly when a person is in analysis, they have enough dreams. They seem to be coming as they're needed. Yes?
I'd like to ask if you can your speculating dreams about dynamic methodology in general across. Don't compete for them. You have to another capable confess. I don't even know how that manifests in your sessions. Is that Jen itself is a great formless in the possession state or what like?
Well, this is one of our favorite, this question is about how an enantiodromia is experienced. It's one of our favorite Jungian words. And what it means is when something goes to its extreme, it then flips over into its opposite. And we see this a lot in the analytic process. When a person is allowed to experience himself in whatever one-sided way that happens, allowed to live out the complexes and allowed to follow whatever is going on all the way to absurdity, there is a natural turnover. And then the unconscious begins to function and turn the thing into its opposite. I don't know if that's any clearer for you. Uh-huh. Yeah, it is experienced in dreams when you get something totally different from your conscious experience of yourself. You see yourself in some very, very different light, or doing something that you wouldn't possibly imagine yourself doing in conscious life. And that's the other side, the repressed side coming up. Yes?
More about your thoughts, even the dreams that you gave us. I'm first glad to take it in by the the few instances.
Yes. All right, I'm going to say something about that. Then I'd like to get back to our case because I think the other dream is going to be quite interesting to you too. The question was, would I say something more about her levitating just a little bit by her own will? And what's going on here are these various levels of consciousness. And her confusion between her own freedom of will and this transpersonal power. Now, she assumes that something that will lift her up to the ceiling is some power outside herself, something supernatural, a god. But she assumes, in the dream that is, that lifting herself up 6 inches is her own power. But anybody seeing it from another perspective realizes that this is ridiculous, that it's just as unlikely to lift yourself up 6 inches as it is to lift yourself up 10 feet. So what's happening in the dream is this peculiar differentiation between levels of consciousness which are all illusory. And the whole thing is the dream. And I think that what's important to recognize is that the different levels of reality are not really so different at all. That the difference comes in the way that we look at it and our own subjective view of it. That there's a kind of reality to the most fantastic, and there's a kind of fantasy to what appears to be most real. I'd like to go on, if I may, because we'll have some other thoughts about the second dream. The woman now is about to make another marriage, and she has this dream before the marriage to a man whose name we'll call Arthur. Now, this is the dream. I'm living in a small, dingy apartment with Arthur. It seems that a tired, thin black woman is working for me, doing the housework. I'm also sheltering her, protecting her from her angry husband who wants to kill her or punish her for something she has unwittingly done wrong. Her husband is fierce and quick, a sort of powerful guy, wiry in a condensed way. Now, Arthur seems slightly indifferent to my protecting this woman, but he is afraid for my safety. Finally, I'm in the apartment alone, and the angry husband bursts in. I hide in a dark closet, but I can see him standing in the doorway with a revolver in his hand. I feel he will come into the hallway near me and shoot me in the lower half of my body. Instantly, this happens. Bang! I'm awake, sitting up in bed. Now, as with the other dream, my first question was, how did you feel when you wakened from the dream? The question was nearly unnecessary, for as we both saw, she had awakened with a start, and, well, she'd awakened with a bang. The dream couldn't be saying anything more clearly, lady, wake up. Now, as I heard the Groffs this morning, I couldn't help but think about a kind of dying and rebirth experience, because here she was killed, and now suddenly she's plunged into waking life, which is another world, another dimension of reality. Now, wake up to what? I'm going to follow Jung's theory of dream interpretation a bit with this one and say that we could consider that the dream could be interpreted on 2 levels. The first level we call the objective level. In that level, every element of the dream is taken just for what it is, a presentation of life, but in a rather cryptic form, with the individuals in the dream all representing themselves, or more accurately, aspects of themselves that are not present in ego consciousness. So the people in the dream would be people outside, not inside necessarily. Now, in this sense, the dream serves a compensatory function, presenting aspects of the dream characters that the dreamer is not aware about, like my man that I dreamed about, who wasn't getting along so well with me. Were we to look at this dream solely from this point of view, we might see it as the dreamer's commentary on Arthur, as viewed from a standpoint somewhat different from that of her ordinary ego consciousness. We might also see the dream as a portrayal of the way she relates to Arthur and how that relationship affects various aspects of her life. But we don't get too far with that interpretation. So we take another one that Jung has suggested, which is the subjective interpretation of the dream. And in this kind of interpretation, we view every element in the dream as an aspect of the dreamer herself. So if we looked at the dream from the subjective level, the dream ego is the woman who lives in the apartment with Arthur. but Arthur is also an aspect of herself that she is unconscious of. So also would the other two figures, the tired black woman and her angry, murderous husband, be parts of herself. And it's the latter aspect of the unconscious, the angry husband, who destroys the dream ego, that is the dreamer. But in the end, it's that destruction, that death, which wakes her up to a fuller consciousness. Now, I don't deny the validity of either of these approaches. They can both be very helpful. What I would like to do here is to incorporate both of these approaches into the broader question of my concern with what is reality. This accords with the concept I'm trying to formulate, the concept that the dream and reality are not two different things, but that reality begins with a pinpoint of focus in conscious awareness and proceeds outwards through many levels or states of consciousness, transforming its nature and content continually as it moves and ultimately pushing back the borders of the unconscious. Now, to return to the dream, it begins in a most unappealing apartment. There's a warning on the objective level that what lies ahead for her in her new marriage may not meet her expectations. Her new husband will be concerned about her safety. He will be protective of her person, but will be indifferent to her needs as a woman, her need to protect and care for that other woman who is oppressed and exploited. But since this woman, this dark woman, does not represent anyone with whom the dreamer is familiar in waking consciousness, we can only suppose that she represents some part of the dreamer herself. So we immediately find ourselves on the subjective level of interpretation. The thin black woman is an aspect of the dreamer of which she's not usually aware. That is, she belongs to another state of consciousness. That this is so is evident when I begin to probe the dreamer with questions as to where she feels inferior and poorly regarded, where she feels undernourished and victimized, where she feels culpable for some wrongdoing of which the nature of which she never quite knows. This is not something that Arthur does to her, but it is something that she is. She is the one who has hired herself out to do the dirty work for a strong, intelligent, lovely woman who is marrying a wise and cultivated man. Well, if this is so, then who is the angry man who unjustly accuses, who threatens the life of the servant woman, but in the end murders the mistress? We can view this man in two ways. In one, he's the dark, unconscious side of Arthur, the side that neither Arthur nor the dreamer recognizes. In the other view, we can say that he's a negative and threatening aspect of the dreamer herself, the one that is so threatening to the uncomprehending servant aspect. Here we can use the concept of the marriage quaternio. That's a view of the relationship between the ego and the unconscious that Jung developed in the process of clarifying the underlying forces in human relationships, as well as the underlying forces in an intrapsychic relationship. So we'll adapt Jung's concept of this marriage quaternio to this particular dream. I'm doing this in the spirit of Jung, if not to be too literal about it, since Jung himself applied this concept of the marriage quaternio to many different situations. Now, there are four characters in the dream, which makes it a natural for this kind of interpretation. The dreamer, Arthur, the servant, and the murderer. Now, I want to make a sketch of this. Now, the top half here is in the ego sphere. This is the area of consciousness. And down here is the area of the unconscious. That's the lower half, and the unconscious, having no boundaries, is extending beyond, goes all the way through the floor. Now, we have the dreamer here. And this is Arthur. Now, in their conscious relationship, it goes both ways. The dreamer relates to Arthur, Arthur relates to the dreamer. Now we have down here in the unconscious, the black woman. Now in Jung's terms, this would be the shadow figure. The shadow is always the unconscious or an unconscious aspect which is of the same sex as the individual. So we all have unconscious aspects that are experienced in our own sex, and they would be shadow figures, whether you're a man or a woman. Then there is the murderer. I'm going to write shadow in here. Now, as most of you probably know, Jung talked of the anima and the animus as archetypes of the opposite sex. That is, our unconscious knowledge, perception of that aspect of ourselves which contains the yin for our yang or the yang for our yin, the opposite which has a different sexual character. Now, this is not to make differentiations between the masculine and the feminine, except in the sense that one dreams men and one dreams women, and this is a way of understanding, of schematizing it so we can better understand what this is all about. So, the murderer is the dreamer's animus. That masculine ending refers to the masculine nature of this part of her unconscious. Now, the black woman has another aspect. Seen from the standpoint of Arthur, it turns out, has not been as free and generous in his unconscious. That is, he's been undermining her in certain ways, which she's failed to recognize, because she represents for Arthur a kind of negative anima. She is the subservient aspect of the dreamer, the oppressed one, the one who will do his bidding without question, the one he can control and manage. And of course, she is not conscious that he has this tendency to do it. At least she wasn't until the dream brought it to her attention. So we begin to see all kinds of interesting relationships here. Her negative masculine side oppresses this, puts this down. There is an unconscious relationship between that driving murderous aspect and this servile aspect, all parts of her. But she's completely unconscious of this that's going on between the two of them. However, she is conscious of this. It was brought to her attention in the analytic process when she had to, I believe it came out when she had to change an appointment because Arthur found it inconvenient that she was away at a certain time, and she found that this was only too willing to cooperate with this. But actually, in cooperating with this, she wasn't really cooperating with this, because he was coming off as a very, very generous and fine person. It was this that was oppressing her. Well, I won't go into too much more of that, but just to give you a feeling for the way one can get in touch with these unconscious relationships that are going on through the schematizing them through the dream. What happens finally in the dream is that the murderer animus, this aspect of herself which keeps down her independence, her freedom, her sense of equality, is the one which finally destroys her. Because he shoots, not this one, but it's this one that he shoots. But as we saw, in the process of destroying her, she goes through death and awakens in another state of consciousness. Now, what do we draw from this? If we remain in our ordinary state of consciousness, everything that goes on in that shadowy area below the line remains unconscious. The limits of awareness are relatively narrow. As long as this is the case, as long as it was the case with this woman, she could carry on a pleasantly superficial relationship with Arthur as she sees him, until from time to time the relationship is going to be interrupted by explosions from the irrational aspects in the psyche, of one or both of them. Meanwhile, in that state of consciousness to which access can best be gained through dreams, the maidservant and the murderer will carry on their threatening and degrading relationship. If that were all there were to it, it wouldn't be so terrible. Who cares what goes on in the unconscious as long as things go reasonably well in life, what we call real life? Who cares? The dream tells us what happens. Sooner or later, the unconscious process breaks through and catches the real person, the ego personality, who is standing in the dark, and destroys her. The function of the dream, and of this dream in particular, is not to destroy us, but to wake us up. Through the unconscious or through the dream state, we can enter a state of higher consciousness, deeper awareness. We can broaden our boundaries and push back the unconscious, the darkness. How could this help the dreamer? Well, she could realize that all the elements in the dream point to aspects of her own nature and to perceptions about the way she's living her life. She could become familiar with the maidservant aspect of her own shadow and the murderous aspect of her own animus. She could see how these aspects, formerly unconscious, supported the negative aspects of Arthur's unconscious. She could then begin to show more concern for the serving aspect, recognizing that a servant is one who takes care of routine and necessary tasks, but frees the mistress for the cultivation of those tasks requiring her special capabilities. The mistress within needs the servant just as much as the servant needs the mistress, and neither one needs to feel apologetic for the other. If the dreamer's inner servant can be allowed the freedom to live without feeling guilty and without feeling oppressed, then she can better deal with her angry husband. A soft answer turneth away wrath is not a bad watchword for a woman who is trying to maintain her integrity as a woman, in the face of the quite natural objection on the part of men who don't quite understand yet what is getting into women these days. If the servant can come to terms with the murderer, then surely the dreamer can develop a better relationship with the man she will marry. In recounting these two dreams and giving you some idea of how I would approach them, I didn't intend to present any kind of system for interpreting dreams. I wanted to show how, through meditating on the emotional texture of the dream, we could get into touch with it, let the dream speak to us, be fully open to its message, and so enlarge the sphere of consciousness. Working on your own dreams, you can do very much the same thing. It's somehow different from working with an analyst, and you perhaps miss some of the objectivity that can be gained from someone who's not personally concerned with your own life and who's trained to deal with psychological matters. But I do feel that all of us, everyone, can work with his own dreams and can get into a relationship where they'll be extremely productive and where we search the pages of the sometimes terrible and sometimes wonderful nighttime adventures that we create for ourselves and come face to face with other levels of consciousness and of meaning. Now, that's all I had prepared to say, and I'd like to get some response or feeling from anyone who would like to react, or any questions you might want to have before we break. Yes. Yes. The comment was that in his own life, he sometimes experiences emotions more crisply, more clearly in a dream than in everyday waking life, and wondered if I'd had that kind of experience working with people. Yes, that very frequently happens. Sometimes dreams, there's a difference between the emotion in a dream and the meaning in a dream. Sometimes we have a tremendous impact of emotion. I know sometimes my dreams, I'm sure you and your dreams, have a really shaking experience. And yet you can wake up with not too much of an idea of what that's all about. And it may take a long, long time before the meaning unfolds. But in our conscious lives, so many of us have been programmed to repress the irrational that we don't allow our emotions to come through to us very clearly. We say, oh, that's foolish, or oh, I really don't feel like that about him, and this pressure then builds up below the threshold of consciousness, and the minute then that we let down our defenses and go to sleep, this crashes through, and you get this terribly perceptive sense of what that emotion is all about. Yes?
In your practice, how do you use the term individuation?
In my practice, how do I use the term individuation?
Well, read the term, and what you should actually read it in reality.
What does it mean in reality? Well, individuation, to begin with, is a process. I don't think it's some place that we get to or something we accomplish. I think it's a kind of orientation which, if I could simply express what I feel about it in my actual practice as I work with people, it's a kind of differentiating process where you see where it is you are like other people. You bring in this bizarre material, and the analyst reassures you and shows you and helps you see for yourself that this fits into one of these matrices, that it isn't something from a deranged mind, but that it's your content poured into a basic form. So how you are like other people, but also the individuation process helps you to see how you're different from other people. And it's somehow the process of steering between the common experiences that you share and that you're able to interrelate to people with that as a basis, and these unique qualities which make you the person that you are, to keep these in some kind of a dynamic balance. That, to me, is the essence of the process of individuation. Please. What is the question between the relationship between the feeling function and emotion? The four functions that Jung talks about, of which one is feeling, is a subjective perception. We feel something, we feel affection, we feel warmth, we feel dislike. Feeling is a kind of evaluative thing, which is subjective. Emotion goes along with feeling, but emotion is more of a something you can measure physiologically. It has to do with the changes in the body under certain conditions. So while they go along together, they're a different perspective. So when I ask somebody, what are you feeling? I expect an answer like, well, I'm feeling terribly anxious. But if I'm looking for somebody's emotions, I would be noticing the color of their skin, the way they're sitting, if they're perspiring, or I would be able to pick that up from physiological signals, body language. Yes?
Yeah, with the 4 different types, we're starting this new school, it's like a psychology. We didn't try on accessory. And we're all young ladies, we're all intuitive type. It's terrible.
It's awful.
Went home, and that's where we recorded that on many. Well, we needed to meet you for statistics, and I think it's called helping us in seminar. So we all had dreams about this guy. Turned out he was a really thinking type, and that's what you need for staff. And so we invited him on to notice, just from the dreaming.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think, of course, I'm a Jungian, I don't think it's so bizarre. I think that, let me say this. I don't feel that one operates blindly on dreams any more than you would go out on any hunch without giving it any thought. But there's a certain something about a spontaneous impression that you get from a dream, like your first impression about a person. I know for myself that I have a first impression about a person, and it generally holds up pretty well. I may go a long way from it, but in the long run, I come back and say to myself, I should have trusted that first impression. And it's like that with dreams, too, because that material is uncontaminated by all your prejudices and all the shoulds and all the oughts that have been programmed into you. And so it's good to pay attention to that, but at the same time that you pay attention to it, it should be checked out against reality. And you didn't immediately, I assume, hire the professor, but you then considered the possibility of hiring him. Yes, please.
In psychology, is there an end product at the end of the line?
Is there an end product in Jungian psychology? No, there really isn't. The point of Jungian psychology, or I guess the point of all of our endeavors, is to expand and develop and to become more truly what we perhaps were intended to become, to get in touch with who we are. But it's, again, as with the person who's gone through mystical experiences, one doesn't come out as a whole and perfect being, but one does frequently move a long way from where one was at the beginning. That's about all I can say about that. Yes. Well, I don't draw charts for my patients to begin with. The question is whether this kind of schema, this kind of frame of reference interferes with the spontaneity of the process. I think that's a very great danger that it could. And I suspect that when people begin to be therapists, they perhaps stay rather close to a frame of reference. It's convenient to have it, but not to be stuck with it or tied to it. I think, speaking for myself, that it's good to have a position from which to move out. I remember my friend, the late Alan Watts, once said when he was asked how he would rear his children in terms of religious education. And Alan had gone a long way from the Episcopal Church by this time, a very long way. But his answer was, I would rear them very strictly in the Episcopalian Church so that when they decide to dissent, they will know what they're dissenting from. I think it goes for any kind of theoretical point of view. Jung started with Freud. He knew what Freud had to say. He knew what he was leaving. He had this kind of solid background and then was able to move out. But I think there's a very great danger of getting stuck in it. And for me, the past couple of weeks of being around California and tasting many different kinds of psychotherapeutic ideas has been very stimulating, and I know that I won't be the same when I get home again. Yes?
Yeah, could you talk more about your dissensions? Because I'm at the same. The thing is that since it continues to bother me, by the you here identify black woman as a name instead of that's another cultural, black.
Right. That's very much of a cultural thing. Mm-hmm.
That really upsets me because carries and perpetuates that kind of stereotyping. Now, where are you depending on what you say and how does it arise?
Well, that's a hard question. Where am I dissenting from this kind of schematic and stereotypical image of the unconscious? Well, for one thing, my own personal dissension, I guess, began with the very beginning of my analytic work, when I was at the Jung Institute, incidentally, not necessarily to study there or to become an analyst, but I happened to be in Zurich and decided that it would be interesting to take a few courses. And the first course I got enrolled in was called Anima and Animus, and there I learned that there was a part of me called the animus, which was going to create all kinds of problems for me because it was masculine and I was a woman, and women had better ride herd on their masculine, so-called masculine tendencies. Well, that rather bothered me because I had just begun to do some creative work, and I'd gotten into various kinds of trouble about it, getting into conflict with certain stereotypes, and the idea of having to repress that or at least channel it and to be very careful. I could voice an opinion, but it had to be, according to the Jungian stereotype, buttressed with all kinds of factual material because women tend to be opinionated. Men are allowed to have opinions. And this kind of thing, this kind of thing irritated me from the very first. And I never really did get that too worked out in my book that I finally wrote trying to simplify some of the ideas of Jungian analysis so that somebody who didn't want to spend 6 years on it could still understand what went on in the analytic process. This book, Boundaries of the Soul, I got to the chapter on anima and animus, and there I got really stuck because I found that trying to explicate Jung's ideas, I got into real trouble about it because I couldn't go along with it, and I couldn't feel, particularly with the changes that have been going on in our culture and the increase in consciousness of women of their more dynamic, active side, the increase in consciousness of men of the possibility of being more receptive. I couldn't get along with the idea that one had to be dominant in the woman and the other had to be dominant in the man, but began to see it more like the Tai Chi that is in a constant state of motion, and that both man and woman can experience the active and passive, the probing and the receiving aspects of their personality in their own rhythm, that there wasn't any particular style that should be suitable for everybody, but that one had to somehow find one's inner center and then get into balance with those qualities. So I guess that essentially, without going any further with that, has led me in a whole new line of thought in which I am concerned with what was just mentioned. I picked up in one of the poems that Joan Groff read, the idea of the androgyne as being a spiritual relatedness of the masculine and feminine qualities within the individual as a kind of other mythology that we have to work on.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, live and self-study courses, archives, this podcast, our blog, or to find Jungian analysts near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2023 donors who gave at the contributor level or above. Barbara Anand, Ph.D. in honor of Fred Maples, S.J., Uni Alcott, Judith and Eric Cooper, David Dalrymple, Mary Doherty, Full Bloom Lotus Center for Self-Awareness, Boris Matthews, Bruce G. and Mary A. Robert Family Foundation, Diane Sherwood, Lawrence C. Tingley, Alexander Wayne and Lynn Kopp, and the Blackbot Giving Fund. You can support this podcast by making a donation at our website, jungchicago.org.